Hey everyone, it's ENDYMION, and I, like many of you, have been playing Black Myth Wukong like crazy. I'm currently in the final chapter. I've beaten the majority of the bosses and secret areas. I'm level 101 right now, and yeah, I'm having a blast. I genuinely think outside of maybe Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that Wukong might be my next in line for Game of the Year, based on the sheer quality of the boss fights and how everything feels like it's been given so much care and attention the entire time. Of course, not everyone thinks that, and I believe I found likely one of the worst articles ever written yet about Black Myth Wukong that is so egregious it prompted me to make this video. And beyond this, another website twisted the words of a legendary creator of Final Fantasy and made them seem to say something that they never actually did. But first, Wukong. This comes from inverse.com, and like I said, it might be one of the worst articles I've read in a month at least. It's titled Black Myth Wukong Isn't Even Good, but that won't stop Chinese nationalist and anti-woke sales. This article is written by a journalist named Shannon Liao. Do not harass this person because I don't think they even know what they're saying half the time. And I'll actually prove to you as I dissect this article that this person is so ill-equipped to even be a games journalist that I wouldn't be surprised if they pursue another career in the short term. So in the beginning of the article, Shannon decides to state that Wukong is a small game that has no variety. I'll read you some of it. She said, and I quote, "In Black Myth Wukong, after I crushed a nasty snake boss, the game's heroic monkey protagonist triumphantly marched through the temple gates only to find another boss. I warily trounced this bear boss too, but what I really wanted was new characters to chat with or a nice spot to lay my head. Perhaps in the game's next chapter, no shot, I walked forward only to enter another area full of aggressive beasts and visually appealing swaths of barren wasteland. After 10 years of game development, Chinese developer Game Science's Black Myth Wukong has had a viral reception, a Tencent minority investment, and unbelievable success on Steam. But while sinking a dozen hours into Black Myth, I couldn't help but think of how gamers over the years would have complained if Elden Ring or Diablo 4 contained such a sparse amount of content. Wukong's world feels empty and devoid of life. Judged by its own merits, cultural and political context aside, Black Myth isn't a particularly inventive game, even if the boss fights are very fun. The environments feel stale and small when you realize most doors stay glued shut and most walls aren't climbable. When I ran through the outer limits of each biome, I found a deserted terrain with nothing to do in between big bosses. The game doesn't offer you any chance to reflect, rest, or enjoy the scenery. Instead, it merely pushes you to the next stage. The assets for the lands repeat. It's almost as if you're trudging through a maze. I haven't come across any side content in the 12 hours I've explored the game. And for non-Chinese speakers, a common refrain is that the narrative and rough translation are confusing. I recommend turning on Chinese dialogue for more flavor and ambiance, but even then it sounds like one guy is acting out all the voices." End quote. Shannon, I'm going to expose you now for being a liar and a grifter yourself, so let's all sit by the fire and learn why we should never trust games journalists, shall we? First of all, you say that you fought a snake boss, so you mean the white noble guy in Chapter 1, which is the first two-stage boss in the game. It's an early skill check, but nothing too crazy. You then say the bear boss, which is the final boss of the first chapter. So you beat one chapter, then you say you entered a barren wasteland, which is the second area of the game. Mind you, getting to the second chapter, it doesn't take long at all. In fact, Chapter 1 of Wukong is maybe 3 hours at best. The second chapter will probably take you around 5 hours if you're thorough with exploring. But Shannon proves that this is about as far as she played because she outs herself almost immediately after. She says that the game has no side content, but this is untrue. In Chapter 1, you can ring 3 bells that leads to a secret area with its own boss fight that gives unique rewards. She never mentions this because, like a good games journalist, she didn't actually explore anything. Instead, she ran from main beat to next and ignored anything around her, which helps her narrative in saying that there's no side content. But it's like a tourist that's visiting a town and then saying that there's nothing to do when they haven't even left their hotel room all day. Plus, in Chapter 2, there's actually quite a bit of side content to do. For example, had you actually played the game for more than 3 hours, you would have known that you could unlock an entire other area where you're able to fight a massive beetle boss that leads to an item that allows you to negate the wind effects that the Chapter 2 final boss can use. This comes in handy not only with this boss, but with many other encounters later on, as you can use this piece of equipment to essentially stun block entire hordes of enemies by activating it when it's available. Of course, Shannon never found this because she barely played the game. Not to mention, you can also find an item behind a breakable wall during the Rat Prince fight. And if you use that item, it actually unlocks 4 different, completely unique boss battles between chapters 1 through 4 of the game. And each boss battle is its own challenge with its own mechanics, environment, and treasures to find. For example, if you go back to Chapter 1's area using the long scale item you find in Chapter 2, you can remove a waterfall out of the way near the beginning of the game to reveal a secret boss that is much harder than the enemies before it. The same can be done in Chapter 2, where you can find a huge dragon boss with 2 big mallets for weapons. There's more, of course, I won't show it all, but again, this is projection, and Shannon is lying when she says that there's no side content in this game. The truth is that she doesn't know there's side content because she barely played it. You beat the tutorial level, and for anyone who's played Wukong past Chapter 1, they know that the game only opens up from there. Chapter 2 is much larger than the first chapter. However, once you hit Chapter 3, the game becomes somehow even more massive, and you could fit, I would wager, 2 or 3 times the amount of surface area and content in Chapter 2 into just Chapter 3. The game opens up like a small river that eventually connects to a massive ocean. Once you hit Chapter 3, and especially Chapter 4 as well, the game's level design expands in massive and intricate ways. Chapters 3 and 4 so far, in my experience, they have been the biggest levels yet. Although, like I said, I'm in the final chapter now, and I'm not sure how big the final chapter is. I just started it last night before I went to bed, and I recently went back to complete some other side areas that I missed, which there are unique, totally optional side areas in chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5 as well. I was actually astounded by how big Wukong had gotten by the time I was midway through chapter 4. The amount of paths before me that led to different boss fights or arenas as I explored, it felt like I was playing Dark Souls again. Plus, Shannon states she spent 12 hours of game time, which would have been enough time to know that chapter 2 at the very least had a lot of bonus content. But she clearly didn't, so she either is just bad at these games and took forever to clear Wukong's tutorial level, or she's lying. But she is a games journalist, so I like to think it's actually both instead. Shannon also outs herself again for not knowing what she is talking about too. In the article she says, "And for non-Chinese speakers, a common refrain is that the narrative and rough translation are confusing. I recommend turning on Chinese dialogue for more flavor and ambiance, but even then it sounds like one guy is acting out all the voices." That's interesting, Shannon, calling other non-Chinese speakers, since you yourself are also not a fluent Chinese speaker either. You act like you have some merit and know what's going on, but that isn't true, is it? Since you actually ousted yourself earlier this year, so let's look into that right now, shall we? Shannon, is this you by any chance on Instagram saying in response to Chinese comments where you said, "Maybe one day I'll know what this says," and on another post below you said, "Oh my god, haha, my Chinese is still not good enough to read this." Thankfully, we have receipts of you saying these things in an English translated version. Oh, and you posted these 17 weeks ago. Well, that means that you couldn't even read Chinese yourself properly, what, 4 months ago? Actually, it gets worse for you still because there's more. Here you said on April 30th, 2024, "I've been taking adult Chinese classes every week in Flushing. I used to wander into bookstores in Taiwan and yearn to read any of the characters, so I think it's about time to become literate." But you then say that you verified and translated the text from Wukong's devs yourself in your tweet about this article from Inverse in August 2024. But like I said, you ousted yourself for not being fluent in Chinese to begin with, so you likely used Google Translate, didn't you? So you're trying to pass off this article of yours stating that Wukong has no side content, is a small game, and just has bosses, when you haven't actually played the full game, because I know you didn't, because everything you explained happened in the first 4 hours of the game. You saying that there's no side content when there's actually plenty, and each region has multiple side quests that you couldn't find because again, you're a games journalist, is very telling. And you stating that non-Chinese speakers should turn on Chinese voice acting for the intricacies is rich, considering that you're not even a fluent speaker of Chinese yourself. You can't even read basic messages on Instagram, and then you claim that Game Science's words on Wukong and such are misogynistic, when you definitely can't read those either, and we know you can't read anything properly too. Because actual Chinese gamers read the comments that you said you couldn't read yourself, and they actually say very basic phrases in that language like awesome, and this one also says very pretty. For someone who says they translated and are some paragon of Chinese speech, you don't even know how to read the language you claim to be using for your own narrative. Shannon, you're lying. I mean, I know you're a games journalist, so what do we expect, but this is not it. You're just as bad as Rebecca Valentine of IGN, but at least she admitted that she got the Chinese parts translated by someone else named Ki-Hoon Chan, who also couldn't translate what was said by Game Science properly either, since the article IGN ran with had plenty of errors and mistranslated text being used in a so-called professional article. Now we have you on Inverse.com lying through your teeth about something you barely played and have no idea how to translate or read yourself. You know how to read what Chinese people say about as well as I do, but at least I don't sit here acting like I know how to read it fluently, because I don't. I hated how these journalists try to paint these narratives, yet they always tell on themselves like this all the time. It's so baffling to see. Shannon then says in her article, this unholy combination may have inadvertently revealed a new path to success for edgy but ultimately mediocre games. She also claims that the combination of Chinese nationalism and online discussion of people rejecting woke nonsense was a perfect storm for Wukong succeeding. And while those two things obviously did have a part, saying the game is mediocre is ridiculous because again, Shannon, you barely played the game. You never even got halfway into Chapter 2 because you don't know anything about the game clearly, you said it yourself. This would be like beating the opening tutorial level in Demon Souls and saying that you know enough to form an opinion on it, yet you haven't even engaged with like 80% of the systems yet. It's illogical and a flat out lie on your own part. Shannon continues in her report, and I quote, "Last year, IGN published a report about the studio being plagued by claims of sexism, a piece that was critiqued by online users which said that the evidence of sexism was merely vulgarity. The evidence cited including social media posts that likened game development to birthing a child and the creator's excitement to sporting an erection." Inverse confirmed the translations independently. The logo for Game Science was also noted by Chinese content creators for its resemblance to sperm. The reality is that IGN's report likely did not dissuade Chinese gamers from supporting Black Myth very much. As it described an internet culture many are familiar and comfortable with, in fact the controversy may have boosted sales by raising awareness of the game. Once upon a time, coming forward with cultural complaints about a piece of media may have facilitated healthy discussions and smarter consumptions a few years ago. But in today's climate, it's more likely to trigger angry factions online and fuel sales of an otherwise ordinary product. It's possible a similar phenomenon happened to PlayStation Stellar Blade, where a series of articles about the misogyny and objectification contained in the game ultimately worked to drive engagement, end quote. Here you go again, Shannon, just lying through your woke brain yet again. This is why I gotta make these videos, because people like yourselves are just lying and thinking that you can get away with it, but nope, not anymore. The IGN article has also been debunked by hundreds of actual native Chinese people that claim that the translations were completely false in the first place. As for stating that Game Science's devs refer to making a game as a sort of birth when it comes to a child, it's not a bad comparison. A game takes a lot of effort to make, obviously, and once it's done and fully developed, it emerges into the worldwide market, much like a child emerges from their mother into life itself. Is it a little crude to compare? Maybe, but Chinese culture is obviously very different when compared to that of typical westernized society. These sayings in Chinese may actually be normal in their society, and like I said in a previous video about this, plenty of countries have weird sayings in their native language that don't really translate well into English. For example, I've heard my entire life when my mom's side of the family is talking to each other or arguing, they will say in Serbian, "Ženska glava," which in Serbian translates roughly to woman's head, which in English, it doesn't really make any sense. Why would you argue with someone and then say woman's head? But the way it's interpreted in Serbian at least, It means more so for the person to use their brain when they talk in the future. Like, you said something stupid, use your head next time, but in Serbian the term would be ženska glava. But like I said, if I were to say that in English to you, you'd probably be confused and say what, but in Serbian, it's totally understandable. And I know for certain many other cultures have similar phrases that make perfect sense in their respective languages, and they also don't translate at all when it comes to English, hence the baby birthing thing that Game Science saying is similar. Same with saying that the game gives them an erection. I can't say for sure if what was translated could have just meant that success excites people, and that's what it really meant, and it was just crudely translated into something more vulgar in order to fit a narrative. But this is why nuance and context are important, otherwise we end up with nonsense like we do now. Shannon ends her article with yet even more moronic statements where she says, "All of these elements combined are a recipe for instant success, but without the rabid fanbase of Chinese nationalists and gamergaters at the ready, I'm not sure anybody would be talking about the Black Myth Wukong in 2024. We've been fed to the gills with great games that challenge our expectations, makes us fall in love with the characters, and obsessively draw fan art or write odes to the narrative. A retelling of a 432-year-old tale with pretty trees and Ragnarok-style combat doesn't entirely hit the spot." Oh my god, Shannon, how can you be this bad at your job? Really? Good lord. Alright, let's dive into this too. How you people get paid to write this slop, I have no idea. Saying that without Chinese gamers and gamer-gators, as you call them, that nobody would talk about Black Myth Wukong? That is so stupid, dude. This is like saying, oh well, without sports fans, sport arenas or games would indeed not be able to fill their seats or be profitable. Like, yeah, Shannon. That's how sports work. That's how games work. You cater to people who are fans of certain things and then they support it. You want to know why Black Myth Wukong sold well? Because it's a Souls-like game which is based on the Soulsborne genre that is made by From Software, which obviously has a pre-established fan base that devours games that are similarly designed to From Software's titles. So saying that Wukong would not sell without Souls-like fans is like, well, yes, that's how fan bases work. Wukong wouldn't even exist how it is without Dark Souls or Bloodborne existing in the first place. That's what subgenres mean, Shannon. You cater to fans of genres, and then when they're interested, they show up and buy things. How you somehow walked past this very obvious concept to push a narrative is beyond stupid to me. My lord, this article is so dumb. Then saying that Wukong has God of War combat is also stupid because in God of War, you can parry on a whim. And you can throw your weapon, and you have an AI companion with you most of the game. Wukong is more like Dark Souls than anything else. You also can't parry in Wukong unless you use the spell Rock Solid, which allows you to turn into solid rock and deflect an attack if you time it correctly, but you can't abuse it. It has a cooldown. But you wouldn't know that, Shannon, because you only played the first level. You probably don't even know the names of the other spells either or what they even do. How about later on that you can unlock even more merchants that can help you? Did you know there's a fox guy who can help you permanently raise stats in exchange for mine cores and money? Did you also know there's a monkey guy who can upgrade your flask? Or did you know that you could fight a weird dragon guy in a robe randomly? And when you finish his quest, it actually allows you to access a scroll that brings you to a small location where all of the NPCs I just mentioned and more are located in one convenient place so that you no longer have to teleport individually anywhere else to see them all. And you can also give seeds to the dragon guy and grow crops, or how certain bosses, if you break certain pieces of them off first, their fights change. And you can also get special items that are missable too. Or did you know that the staff isn't your own melee weapon and you can also unlock spears as well that have their own unique movesets? And did you know that there's tons of different weapon combos in the game that strengthen different styles of combat? Or how you can unlock a blacksmith to upgrade any armor you want if you have the resources and money to do so, instead of waiting for new pieces to unlock via story or side quests? Or that there's different flasks that have varying drinking options that allow you to use flasks that, for example, charge parts of your mana per sip or heal your duplicates. Or ones that increase your attack for a small period of time after you drink it. Or my personal favorite flask, which heals 18% of your health initially, then 48% more of your health over the next few seconds. I love that one. Did you also know that there's plenty of places to meditate too, since you said earlier in your article that there's nowhere to relax or take in the scenery? But that's a lie, and in reality, you just barely played the game or know what you're talking about? Did you know, Shannon, that you're lying, and that your entire article is bad and you should probably delete it because the longer it exists, the more embarrassing it gets for you? This is genuinely one of the worst research and presented articles that I've read in a long time. Every paragraph that I read on this is a new level of stupidity. Everyone involved with this article at Inverse should be ashamed of themselves, and proves yet again that these games journalists in fact do not play or know anything about the games that they speak on. I would say get some credibility, but that would be about as possible as witnessing a fish fly or a feminist admit that they were wrong all along. So congratulations, Shannon of Inverse, you have written one of the dumbest articles in a very long time. Please never speak on Black Myth Wukong ever again, because if it was this easy to disprove you this time, I shudder to think what shenanigans that you'll get up to in the future. For the sake of all of our brain cells, please take writing classes. And from one non-Chinese speaker to another, never say that you translated anything ever again. Thank you. I also want to look at this other article that kind of ties into what I've been talking about here as well, which is yet again journalists lying and twisting words to fit narratives. This is from thegamer.com. Final Fantasy creator says games need to be political. You probably read that and went, did he actually say that? Spoilers, he did not actually in fact say any of that. And instead the gamer, like IGN and all the rest, are twisting the words of yet another Asian creator to fit their agenda. The gamer said, and I quote, 61-year-old Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, who is also one of the minds behind iconic games like Chrono Trigger, Parasite Eve, and Legend of Mana, recently spoke about what he believes makes for a good Final Fantasy game. The answer being politically aware. If I had to give some kind of core ingredient, I would say it's the story and world. Those two are a must for any Final Fantasy and the common denominator across all of them. The world setting needs to contain some kind of thematic element that is loosely tied to current events, Sakaguchi explained in an interview with Inverse, end quote. The rest of the article, the gamer's writer here, James Troughton, he just kind of starts spoiling tons of Final Fantasy game stories with examples. But this does not mean that the games are inherently political at all. In reality, the stories of Final Fantasy do take concepts from the real world, but they also smartly funnel them through the lens of fantasy to invoke interest in the people that play it. The difference between Final Fantasy XVI's views on slavery and using magic as an allegory for resources is not a nod at current day events per se, but instead it presents ideas within the world that we've known for a long time and then shows them in unique ways that make them more enjoyable to digest. The difference here in 16's case anyway is that slavery in the creator's eyes here is not based on skin color but class and birth instead. People who are born with magic, they're enslaved because the people of Valisthea have become accustomed to the conveniences that magic offers. You could argue the magic of Final Fantasy XVI's story is an allegory for technology as well, and how people are so dependent on tech like their phones or computers or Wi-Fi routers that when these things are taken away from them, they don't even know what to do with themselves. I don't think that's political. It's just a unique way of presenting something we know in the vein of a fantasy setting. The difference also is that Final Fantasy's characters are never considered to be strictly liberal or conservative. Whereas in Western-made content, it's very obvious that most of the time the heroes are liberals and the bad guys are conservatives. Take one look at the recent Dustborn to see what I mean about that. The Final Fantasy games have always been about people finding new paths in life and then fighting for a new future. For example, Cecil in Final Fantasy IV starts off as a military commander of airships, but ends the game a magical warrior knight that is fighting on the moon. Cloud and such in Final Fantasy VII, they start off as revolutionaries fighting against an unjust system and company. But the story does eventually evolve into a group of individuals assembling to save their world from the threat of celestial annihilation by the hands of a would-be god who has alien blood in them. It's a weird story. Great game though. The political-esque aspect of the games is not there the entire time, but it's a jumping off point to a far more interesting and nuanced story every single time. Final Fantasy Tactics out of them all is probably the most political, but even that game eventually becomes about gods and monsters and how history can be altered by those who hold the pen. Like Inverse's Shannon Liao not knowing what she's talking about, the gamer's James Troughton here also tries to say that Final Fantasy has always been political, but it hasn't. There's nothing political about the actual big bad of Final Fantasy XVI, for example, or their motives, which I don't want to talk about here because of spoilers, obviously. But using ideas from the real world like slavery or reliance on technology or magic in this case, it's a good way of using the real world to influence the story that they want to tell, but smartly ensuring that the heart of the tale is about the characters and not pushing an ideology first. Which is why in Final Fantasy's case, they will continue to win and be beloved, and like many journalists, they'll continue to crap their pants and scream as they keep losing. From Black Myth Wukong's horrible article to the gamer being morons about Final Fantasy, This entire video just proves to you that you should always question what you read or see online. Keep an open mind, don't take anything these websites say at face value, and always dig deeper. For a bunch of so-called journalists, their work reads more like propaganda than anything else. Thank you for watching, subscribe, share, and like the video. Thanks to my patrons and members, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you soon.